The sun hung low over the western hills, painting the Sea of Galilee in shades of amber and gold that shimmered across waters as old as memory itself. The locals called it Kinneret, the harp, because its shape resembled the ancient instrument, a body of fresh water cradled in the hills of the lower Galilee like a jewel set in the earth by the hand of God. 13 miles from north to south, 8 miles at its widest point, surrounded by slopes that descended steeply to meet its shores, this lake had sustained generations of fishermen, watered countless flocks, and witnessed more of human drama than any sea 10 times its size. On this particular evening, the shore near Capernaum was crowded with more people than the fishing village typically saw in a week. They had come from every direction, from the surrounding towns, from the hill country to the west, from as far away as Jerusalem and the regions beyond the Jordan. Word of the teacher from Nazareth had spread like fire through dry grass, and wherever he went, the crowds followed. They brought their sick, their demon-possessed, their desperate questions and hungry souls. They pressed so close that normal movement became impossible, so numerous that even standing space grew scarce along the narrow strip of beach between the water and the rising hills. Jesus had solved the problem with the practical wisdom that characterized so much of his ministry. He had borrowed a boat, Peter's boat, as it happened, the same vessel from which the fisherman had once reluctantly cast his nets at Jesus' command and hauled in a catch that nearly sank 2 boats, and pushed out a short distance from the shore. The water created separation, the gentle slope of the beach created a natural amphitheatre, and his voice carried across the glassy surface with remarkable clarity. All day long he had taught from that floating pulpit, the boat rocking softly beneath him, the crowds arrayed along the shoreline like wheat awaiting harvest. The parables had flowed from his lips in an unending stream. He spoke of a sour scattering seed on different soils, of a lamp that should not be hidden under a basket, of seed growing secretly in the earth, of a mustard seed so small it could barely be seen yet destined to become a tree, large enough for birds to nest in its branches. The images were drawn from the world, his listeners knew, the fields they ploughed, the lamps they lit, the gardens they tended, yet the meanings reached toward realities they could barely comprehend. He was speaking of the kingdom of God, of how it came and grew and transformed everything it touched, and the people listened with the rapt attention of those who sensed they were hearing something that would change their lives if only they could fully grasp it. The disciples occupied positions of privilege throughout the day, some in the boat with Jesus, others managing the crowd along the shore, all of them exhausted by the sheer magnitude of what they were witnessing. They were still new to this life, plucked from their fishing nets and tax booths mere months ago, thrust into a ministry that exceeded anything they had imagined when they first agreed to follow this carpenter's son from Nazareth. Every day brought fresh wonders, fresh challenges, fresh evidence that they had attached themselves to someone utterly unlike anyone else who had ever walked the earth. Peter sat near the stern of his own boat, watching Jesus teach with an expression that mixed pride with bewilderment. This was his vessel being used for such holy purpose, his livelihood transformed into an instrument of the kingdom. He had been a fisherman all his life, as his father had been before him, as his sons would likely have been after him if this strange new calling had not interrupted everything. Now he caught different prey, or rather, he was learning to participate in a catch he did not control, following a master whose methods defied everything he thought he knew about how the world worked. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, flanked their master with the protective intensity that had earned them the nickname Sons of Thunder. They were fishermen too, partners with Peter in a business that had supported their families for generations. Their father Zebedee still worked the boats, still mended the nets, still hauled in catches of tilapia and sardines while his sons wandered the countryside with an itinerant rabbi. The old man had watched them go with something between pride and confusion, uncertain whether they were pursuing destiny or abandoning duty. Andrew stood at the water's edge, helping to manage the crowd, directing people to positions where they could hear, gently turning away those who tried to push past the natural boundaries that the gathering required. He had been the first to find Jesus, the first to bring someone else, his brother Peter, into the circle that was slowly forming around the Nazarene. That priority gave him no special status among the disciples. but it gave him a particular investment in everything that unfolded. He had started this, in a sense. He had heard John the Baptist point toward Jesus and declare him the Lamb of God, and he had followed, and everything since had flowed from that initial decision. The other disciples were scattered through the scene, Matthew the former tax collector still adjusting to acceptance by men who would have despised him months ago, Philip from Bethsaida, the one who asked practical questions and received answers that transcended practicality, Nathanael, whose initial skepticism had melted into devotion after a single encounter beneath a fig tree. 12 men, called from ordinary lives into an extraordinary adventure, struggling to keep pace with a master who seemed determined to shatter every expectation they had ever formed about God and the world he had made. As the afternoon wore on, the shadows lengthened across the water, and the golden light began to fade toward the softer hues of evening. The crowd showed no sign of dispersing. If anything, they pressed closer as the day waned, reluctant to lose a moment of the teaching that had captured their attention so completely. But Jesus could see what they could not: the weariness in their eyes, the hunger in their bodies, the limits of human attention that even the most compelling words could not indefinitely overcome. Along the shore, fishermen who had not joined the crowds began their evening routines. The Sea of Galilee was most productively fished at night, when the fish rose closer to the surface and the darkness allowed nets to be cast without startling the catch. Boats were being prepared, nets inspected for tears, lamps lit against the coming darkness. The familiar rhythms of Galilean life continued alongside the extraordinary events unfolding on the beach, the mundane and the miraculous occupying the same space, separated only by attention and awareness. The lanterns began to flicker into life as the sun touched the hills. Their warm glow dotted the shoreline like earthbound stars, creating pools of light where fishermen gathered their gear and families prepared evening meals. The smell of cooking fires drifted across the water, mingling with the salt and fish scent that permanently marked this place. Children who had grown restless during the long hours of teaching were finally released to play, their laughter rising above the murmur of adult conversation. The day was ending, and with it the formal teaching that had held everyone in place. Jesus turned to his disciples with an instruction that seemed simple enough at the time. Let us go over to the other side. The other side. The eastern shore of the lake, where the hills of the Decapolis rose above Gentile territory, where the culture shifted and the population changed and the comfortable certainties of Jewish Galilee gave way to something foreign and unknown. They had not spent much time on that side. There were reasons for that. Reasons rooted in centuries of separation between Jew and Greek, between the people of God and the nations that surrounded them. But Jesus had said it with the same calm authority that characterized all his instructions, and the disciples had learned that his commands, however unexpected, were always worth following. They began to prepare the boat for the crossing. It was not a long journey, perhaps 4 or 5 miles to the nearest landing on the eastern shore, but nighttime crossings required attention to detail. The Sea of Galilee was notorious for its sudden storms, violent squalls that could arise with almost no warning as cold air rushed down from the surrounding heights and collided with the warm air over the water. Experienced fishermen like Peter and the sons of Zebedee knew this danger intimately. They had weathered many such storms, had learned to read the subtle signs in the sky, and the water that sometimes preceded them had developed the instincts that allowed them to survive what the lake could throw at them. This evening, however, the signs were favourable. The wind was gentle, the water calm, the sky clear except for the pink and orange remnants of sunset fading in the west. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening east, faint at first but growing brighter as the light continued to drain from the day. It seemed like an ideal night for a crossing, peaceful, quiet, the kind of evening that fishermen treasured for its easy sailing and predictable conditions. Other boats joined them as they pushed away from the shore, small craft carrying curious followers who were not ready for the day to end, who wanted to see where Jesus was going and what he would do when he arrived. Mark's Gospel mentions these vessels almost in passing, a detail easily overlooked but important for understanding that Paul and the disciples were not alone on the water that night. A small flotilla was setting out across the darkening lake, following the teacher from Nazareth toward whatever awaited on the far side. Jesus made his way to the stern of the boat, the raised rear section where a cushion had been placed. Perhaps the leather pillow that fishermen used when sleeping aboard their vessels during long nights on the water. He was exhausted. The day had demanded everything he had to give, teaching for hours without rest, ministering to the crowds that pressed against him from every side, pouring out spiritual energy in quantities that left his human body depleted and drained. He was fully God, but he was also fully man, and his humanity required rest just as surely as any other man's. He lay down, settled his head on the cushion, and within moments was asleep. The disciples watched him with something approaching wonder. How could anyone sleep at a time like this, with so much happening, with so many people still hungry for his words, with a journey underway that would take them into unfamiliar territory? But there was also something deeply reassuring about his rest. If Jesus could sleep, then surely there was nothing to worry about. If the Master was at peace, then peace must be appropriate for the circumstances. His calm became their calm, his rest an implicit permission for their own tired bodies to relax into the journey. The boat glided away from the shore, leaving behind the lanterns and the crowds and the familiar contours of Capernaum. The disciples settled into their positions, some managing the sail that caught what little wind was available, others taking up oars to supplement their progress, still others simply sitting and watching the shoreline recede into the gathering darkness. The water lapped gently against the hull, a soothing rhythm that had accompanied every journey they had ever made across this lake. Behind them, the coast of Galilee grew smaller, its lights shrinking to pinpoints, before disappearing entirely as the boat moved toward the center of the lake. Ahead, the eastern shore was invisible in the darkness, a destination they knew was there but could not yet see. Above them, the stars emerged in their full glory, the vast canopy of the heavens spreading from horizon to horizon, unmarred by the light pollution that would one day obscure such views from most of humanity. The disciples had no way of knowing what the next few hours would hold. They carried with them the teachings of the day, parables about seeds and soil, about hidden lamps and growing kingdoms, but they did not yet understand how those teachings would be tested, how the theoretical faith Jesus had described would soon demand practical application in circumstances that would strip away every pretense of self-sufficiency. For now, there was only the quiet boat, the calm water, the sleeping master, and the gentle journey across a lake they thought they knew. The peace of the moment was real, the tranquility of the evening undisturbed by any hint of what was gathering in the darkness beyond the reach of their vision. They rowed on, conversations drifting into comfortable silence, bodies settling into the familiar motion of a boat at sea. The night deepened around them, the air cooling as it always did once the sun departed. Everything seemed exactly as it should be, but somewhere in the hills that surrounded the lake, cold air was beginning to move. Somewhere beyond the horizon they could not see, forces were stirring that would soon descend upon them with a fury that would test everything they thought they believed. The storm was coming. They just didn't know it yet. The oars dipped into black water with a rhythm as old as the lake itself. The disciples had made this motion 10,000 times before. The pull, the lift, the reach, the pull again, their bodies moving through the familiar pattern without conscious thought. The boat responded to their efforts with the steady forward progress that had carried them across these waters since childhood, the wooden hull cutting through the gentle swells with a soft hissing sound that seemed almost like breathing. Peter had taken the steering oar at the stern, positioning himself near where Jesus slept. From this vantage point he could guide the boat's direction, while keeping one eye on the master and another on the horizon ahead. The responsibility sat naturally on his shoulders. This was his vessel, his trade, his domain of expertise. Whatever mysteries Jesus had introduced into his life, whatever confusions followed him through his days now, at least on the water, Peter knew what he was doing. The boat was solid beneath him, the oars were in capable hands, and the night spread out before them like a promise of safe passage. The other boats that had followed them from shore were visible as darker shapes against the dark water, their presence marked more by the occasional splash of oars or murmur of voices than by anything the eye could clearly distinguish. They maintained a loose formation, close enough to feel connected but far enough to avoid collision in the darkness. The followers in those vessels had their own reasons for making this crossing. Curiosity, devotion, the simple unwillingness to let Jesus out of their sight after the day they had experienced. They would arrive at the eastern shore whenever the lead boat arrived, content to follow wherever the teacher led. For perhaps the first hour, the journey proceeded in comfortable silence punctuated by quiet conversation. The disciples were exhausted, their bodies heavy with the accumulated fatigue of a day spent managing crowds, and straining to absorb teaching that seemed designed to stretch their minds beyond their natural capacity. But exhaustion in good company has its own sweetness, and the gentle motion of the boat created a cocoon of intimacy that invited reflection. Andrew was the first to break the silence with substance. He had been turning over the parables in his mind since Jesus first spoke them, and a question had formed that he could not quite resolve on his own. "The sower," he said, his voice low enough not to disturb the sleeping master. "Do you think we're the good soil, or are we still being tested to see what kind we'll turn out to be?" James considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think we're all of them," he said finally. "Good soil on the days we listen well, rocky ground when our enthusiasm fades, thorny soil when the world distracts us." He paused, working through the implications. Maybe that's the point. Maybe we have to choose, every day, which soil we'll be. John, his brother, shook his head slightly. But the soil in the parable doesn't choose. It just is what it is. The seed falls, and the soil responds according to its nature. He glanced toward the sleeping form at the stern. "I wonder if he means something different than we're understanding." These conversations had become common among the disciples, late-night wrestling matches with words and ideas that seemed to carry more weight than any teaching they had encountered before. The rabbis in the synagogues spoke with confidence about the law and the prophets, interpreting ancient texts with well-worn arguments that had been refined over generations. Jesus spoke as if he were writing new texts, as if the authority resided not in tradition but in himself. It was disorienting, exhilarating, and frequently incomprehensible. Matthew, who had joined the group more recently than the fisherman, brought a different perspective to these discussions. His years as a tax collector had trained him to think in terms of transactions, of debits and credits, of systems that balanced according to predictable rules. The kingdom Jesus described operated by different mathematics entirely. A kingdom where the last were first, where losing one's life was the way to find it, where mustard seeds became trees and hidden treasure was worth selling everything to possess. "What I don't understand," Matthew said, his voice thoughtful, "is why he speaks in parables at all. Why not just say what he means directly? The crowds would understand better, wouldn't they?" Philip, practical as always, offered an answer. Maybe understanding isn't the point, or not the only point. He paused, organising his thoughts. "When my father taught me to repair nets, he didn't explain everything in words. He showed me, and then he let me try, and I learned by doing it wrong until I learned to do it right. Maybe parables are like that. They make us work for the meaning, so when we find it, we actually own it." The conversation drifted on, moving from parable to parable, memory to memory, question to question. They talked about the healings they had witnessed, the demons that had fled at Jesus' command, the authority with which he forgave sins and challenged the religious establishment. Each miracle raised new questions even as it answered old ones. Who was this man they were following? What exactly had they signed up for when they left their nets and their tax booths to walk with him? Nathanael, who spoke less frequently than some of the others, offered an observation that silenced the group for a long moment. "Under the fig tree," he said, referring to his first encounter with Jesus. "He told me he had seen me before Philip ever came. He knew my thoughts, my prayers, the things I had never spoken to anyone." His voice carried the weight of memory. "I called him the Son of God that day. I'm not sure I understood what I was saying. I'm still not sure I understand." The words hung in the air, mixing with the sound of oars and water and the gentle creaking of the boat's timbers. The Son of God. It was a title that carried implications none of them were fully prepared to explore, that pointed toward conclusions their religious training had not equipped them to draw. They had been raised on stories of prophets and kings, of judges and patriarchs, who spoke with God and acted in his name. But the Son of God was something else entirely, something that the scriptures hinted at in mysterious passages that the rabbis debated endlessly without resolution. Jesus slept on, oblivious to their theological wrestling, his breathing steady and peaceful. The cushion beneath his head was a simple thing, probably stuffed with dried grass or wool, the kind of pillow that fishermen kept aboard for the nights when they slept on the water, between casting and hauling their nets. But there was something about seeing him there, so utterly at rest, that added another layer to the mystery. What kind of man could sleep so peacefully in the middle of everything that was happening around him? What kind of confidence, what kind of trust, what kind of certainty about the nature of reality allowed for such complete surrender to rest? The night deepened as they talked, the darkness growing more absolute as even the faint glow of sunset faded from the western horizon. The stars came, out in full force now, not the scattered points of early evening, but the overwhelming cascade of light that only unpolluted skies could display. The Milky Way arched overhead like a river of luminescence, and the familiar constellations that had guided sailors and shepherds for millennia traced their ancient patterns across the dome of heaven. The air grew cooler as it always did after sunset, the warmth of the day radiating away into the vastness of space. Some of the disciples pulled their cloaks tighter around their shoulders, adjusting to the temperature drop with the automatic response of men accustomed to nights on the water. The change was normal, expected, nothing to cause concern. The Sea of Galilee sat several hundred feet below sea level, cradled in a basin that could trap heat during the day and release it quickly at night. Every fisherman knew this rhythm, had dressed for it 1,000 times, had planned their nights around its predictable progression. But something else was shifting in the atmosphere, something more subtle than simple cooling. Peter noticed it first, a change in the quality of the air, a heaviness that had not been there before. He lifted his head and scanned the horizon, searching for the visual confirmation of what his instincts were beginning to suggest. The stars still blazed overhead, the water still lay calm around them, but somewhere in the distance the sky seemed darker than it should have been. Not the darkness of night, which was uniform and expected, but a concentrated darkness, a blotting out of stars that suggested something solid moving across the heavens. He said nothing at first, not wanting to alarm the others unnecessarily. The Sea of Galilee was prone to sudden weather changes, and experienced fishermen learned to read the signs early enough to reach shore before conditions deteriorated. But they were in the middle of the lake now, equidistant from both shores, committed to their crossing in a way that limited their options if trouble developed. The eastern shore was their destination. The western shore was no longer close enough to offer easy refuge. A breath of wind touched his face. Not the gentle breeze that had accompanied them since they left Capernaum, but something different. This wind came from a new direction, carrying a chill that felt out of place, tasting faintly of the high places where snow still clung to distant peaks, even in late spring. Peter knew that taste. He had felt winds like this before, rushing down from the heights through the ravines that funneled air toward the lake's surface. They could bring squalls that arose from nothing and vanished just as quickly, or they could herald something worse, the violent storms that made the Sea of Galilee notorious among sailors throughout the region. James had noticed it too. He caught Peter's eye across the length of the boat, and a silent communication passed between them, the wordless understanding of men who had worked, together in dangerous conditions, who knew each other's instincts, who recognized when concern was warranted even before it could be articulated. James tilted his head slightly toward the northeast, where the darkness seemed thickest, and Peter nodded in response. They were both seeing the same thing, both feeling the same subtle wrongness in the air. The disciples, who were not fishermen, remained unaware of the shift. Their conversation had moved on to other topics, their attention focused inward on the ideas they were exploring rather than outward on the environment that surrounded them. They trusted the fishermen to handle the boat, to navigate the crossing, to manage whatever maritime challenges might arise. It was a reasonable division of labour, a natural allocation of responsibility based on expertise and experience. But the fishermen were growing quiet now, their professional instincts overriding their participation in the theological discussion. Peter's hand tightened on the steering oar, making subtle adjustments to their course, positioning the boat to meet whatever was coming from the best possible angle. John had moved to check the sail, ensuring that the rigging was secure and could be quickly adjusted if conditions demanded. Andrew had taken up a position near the bow, peering into the darkness ahead, trying to gauge their distance from the eastern shore and whether they could reach it before the weather broke. A distant sound reached their ears, so faint at first that it might have been imagination, a trick played by tired minds and the natural noises of a boat at sea. But it grew slowly louder, a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thunder, perhaps, though no lightning had been visible, or maybe just the sound of wind moving through the ravines, amplified by the acoustic properties of the surrounding hills. Whatever it was, it added another note of tension to the growing unease that the fishermen were struggling to contain. The surface of the water began to change. The gentle swells that had characterized their journey so far were developing an edge, a choppiness that made the boat's motion less predictable. Small waves slapped against the hull with more force than before, and the steady hissing of their passage took on a harder, more percussive quality. The change was gradual enough that someone not paying attention might not have noticed, but the fishermen noticed. They always noticed. Peter glanced toward Jesus, still sleeping peacefully at the stern, and felt something twist in his chest. Part of him wanted to wake the master, to share the burden of the approaching danger with the one who seemed to have answers for everything. But another part resisted. What would he say? That the wind had shifted, that the water was getting rougher. These were not emergencies yet, just the ordinary challenges of a nighttime crossing. There was no need to disturb Jesus' rest over what might turn out to be nothing. And yet, as Peter turned his eyes back toward the darkening horizon, he could not shake the feeling that this night was about to become something far more than ordinary. The peace they had carried with them from the shore was beginning to fray at the edges, and the darkness ahead seemed to promise a testing that none of them had anticipated. The boat sailed on, carrying its precious cargo toward the heart of whatever was waiting for them in the night. The oars continued their rhythm, the disciples continued their conversations, and the master continued to sleep with a peace that would soon seem almost impossible. The first true gust of wind hit them without warning, a cold blast that came screaming down from the heights and struck the boat like a physical blow. The storm had arrived. The wind came howling out of the darkness like something alive and hungry, a force of nature so sudden and so violent that the disciples had no time to prepare. One moment they were sailing through the quiet night, wrapped in their theological musings and the gentle rhythm of the oars. The next moment the world had become chaos, a screaming, churning maelstrom that seized the boat and shook it like a toy in the hands of an angry child. The sail, which had been hanging slack in the calm air, suddenly filled with a force that nearly capsized them on the spot. The wooden mast groaned under the strain, the rope snapping taut with sounds like whip cracks. John lunged for the rigging, his hands finding the familiar lines by instinct rather than sight, hauling desperately to bring the sail down before the wind tore it to shreds or pulled the mast from its seating. James was beside him in an instant, the brothers working together with the coordination born of a lifetime on the water, fighting against a wind that seemed determined to rip every advantage from their grasp. Peter shouted commands that were swallowed by the roar almost before they left his lips. He had been through storms before. Every fisherman on the Sea of Galilee had stories of nights when the weather turned and survival became the only priority. But this storm was different. This storm had arrived with a malevolence that went beyond anything he had experienced in all his years on the water. The wind did not merely blow, it attacked. The waves did not merely rise, they assaulted. Everything about this tempest felt personal, targeted, as if the forces of nature had specifically chosen this boat, this night, these passengers for destruction. The first wave broke over the bow with a crash that sent water flooding across the deck. The disciples who had been sitting amidships were drenched in an instant, the cold shock of the lake driving the breath from their lungs. Matthew, who had never been a sailor, scrambled for something to hold onto as the boat pitched wildly beneath him. Philip grabbed his arm, steadying him, shouting something that the wind erased before it could reach. His ears! The neat division between fishermen and landlubbers that had characterized their journey so far dissolved in the face of a crisis that threatened them all equally. The Sea of Galilee's storms were legendary throughout the region, and for good reason. The lake sat in a bowl surrounded by hills, with the Jordan River Valley creating a natural funnel for weather systems moving through the area. Cold air from the heights could rush down through the ravines with almost no warning, colliding with the warm air over the water and generating violent turbulence. Boats had been lost on this lake. Fishermen had died. The locals knew to respect the water's moods, to read the signs, to seek shelter when the sky turned threatening. But there had been no signs tonight. The sky had been clear, the air calm, the conditions ideal for a peaceful crossing. Whatever had generated this storm had done so with a suddenness that defied the normal patterns, as if the weather itself had been waiting in ambush for this particular boat and these particular passengers. Wave after wave crashed over the gunwales now, each one adding to the water that was accumulating in the bottom of the boat. The vessel sat lower in the water with every passing moment, its buoyancy compromised by the weight of the lake that had invaded its hull. The disciples without sailing experience found themselves pressed into service bailing, cupping their hands, grabbing whatever containers they could find, scooping water and hurling it over the side in a desperate attempt to keep the boat afloat. It was exhausting work, made nearly impossible by the constant motion that threw them off balance and sent them stumbling into each other and the equipment that cluttered the deck. Andrew had found a wooden bucket and was bailing with the methodical determination of a man who understood exactly how serious their situation had become. His face was set in hard lines, his jaw clenched against the cold and the fear, his arms burning with the effort of lifting and throwing water that seemed to return almost as quickly as he could remove it. This was not sustainable. They could not bail fast enough to overcome the waves that continued to pour over the sides. Unless something changed, the boat would eventually take on more water than it could carry, and the Sea of Galilee would claim another set of victims. The wind screamed through the rigging with a sound like tortured souls, a high keening that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the terror centres of the brain. The mast, now stripped of its sail, swayed dangerously with each gust, threatening to snap or tear free from its moorings. Lightning flickered in the distance, or perhaps not so distant, it was hard to tell in the disorientation of the storm, and thunder rolled across the water like the drumbeat of approaching judgment. The darkness that had seemed peaceful an hour ago had become absolute and threatening, the stars completely obscured by the clouds that had materialized from nowhere to cover the sky. Peter fought the steering oar with all his strength, trying to keep the bow pointed into the waves. This was basic seamanship instilled in him since childhood. When the waves were high, you faced them head on. A wave hitting the side of the boat could roll it, could swamp it, could end everything in a single catastrophic moment. But the wind was shifting constantly, the waves coming from multiple directions at once, and the boat responded sluggishly to his commands as the water in its belly compromised its handling. He was losing the fight. He could feel it in his muscles, in the resistance of the oar, in the way the boat wallowed rather than responded to his corrections. James and John had finished securing the sail and were now moving through the boat, checking for damage, helping the less experienced disciples, doing everything that could be done in conditions that allowed for almost nothing to be done. Their faces were grim, their movements urgent but controlled. They had been in bad situations before, had survived storms that should have killed them, had earned their reputation as capable seamen through years of facing exactly these kinds of challenges. But even they were beginning to show signs of something that Peter had rarely seen in either of them. Fear. Real fear. The kind that goes beyond healthy respect for danger and enters the territory of genuine terror. The boat lurched violently as a particularly large wave struck them broadside. Peter had lost the angle, just for a moment, but that moment was nearly enough. Water poured over the gunwale in a solid sheet, adding more weight to the already overburdened hull. Someone cried out. It might have been Nathaniel, or Thomas, or one of the others whose voices Peter couldn't distinguish in the chaos. The cry was not words, just sound, the primal vocalization of a human being confronting the real possibility of death. And through it all, impossibly, unbelievably, Jesus slept. He had not moved from his position at the stern. The cushion still cradled his head. His body still rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing that the disciples could not see in the darkness, but somehow knew continued uninterrupted. The waves that soaked everyone else seemed to part around him, or perhaps the raised stern offered some protection, or perhaps there was something else at work that defied natural explanation. Whatever the reason, The Master remained in that posture of perfect rest while his disciples fought for their lives around him. The contrast was maddening. Here they were, experienced fishermen and novice sailors alike, pouring every ounce of their strength into the struggle for survival, and their teacher slept as peacefully as if they were still tied to the dock in Capernaum. Did he not see the waves crashing over them? Did he not hear the wind screaming through the rigging? Did he not feel the boat pitching and rolling beneath him with a violence that should have thrown him from his makeshift bed a dozen times over? Philip was the first to give voice to what they were all thinking. "How can he sleep?" he shouted to Andrew, his voice barely audible above the storm. "How is it possible?" Andrew had no answer. He just shook his head and kept bailing, his face a mask of exhaustion and confusion. The question hung in the air alongside all the other questions that this night had generated. Questions about the nature of this man they followed, about the peace he seemed to carry within him, about the relationship between his calm and their chaos that seemed to grow more paradoxical with every passing moment. The boat shuddered again, a grinding vibration that ran through the timbers and spoke of stresses approaching their limits. Peter knew that feeling. He had felt it before, on a night long ago when he was young and foolish, and had stayed out too long in weather he should have avoided. That boat had not survived the night. He had made it to shore clinging to wreckage, half drowned and frozen, lucky to be alive. The memory rose unbidden, adding historical evidence to his present terror. They were going to sink. The realization crystallized with horrible clarity. The water was coming in faster than they could bail it out. The wind showed no signs of abating. The waves continued their relentless assault on a boat that was already wounded and weakening. Unless something changed, something dramatic, something beyond their power to produce, this journey was going to end at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee. Matthew had stopped bailing. His arms had given out, his strength exhausted, his body slumped against the side of the boat in an attitude of defeat. He stared at the sleeping form of Jesus with an expression that mixed desperation with something approaching anger. They had left everything to follow this man. They had abandoned their livelihoods, their families, their futures, on the strength of his invitation and the power of his presence. And now, in the moment of their greatest need, he was asleep while they drowned, asleep while the boat filled with water and the wind tore at their sails, and the waves crashed over them without mercy. The other boats that had followed them from shore were no longer visible. Whether they had turned back or scattered in the storm or already succumbed to the waves, the disciples had no way of knowing. They were alone on the water, isolated in their crisis, cut off from any possibility of help from other vessels. The darkness that surrounded them was complete, the clouds blocking every star, the shoreline invisible in both directions. They could have been anywhere, the middle of the lake, 100 feet from safety, lost in some endless ocean that had no shores at all. The disorientation added another layer of terror to an already overwhelming experience. Peter's arms were burning, his grip on the steering oar, weakening with every moment. He had nothing left. All his experience, all his strength, all his determination to save his boat and his friends, none of it was enough. The storm was winning. The storm was going to kill them all. And their master, the one who had commanded them to make this crossing, the one who had promised them a future beyond their fishing nets, was sleeping through their destruction. The breaking point arrived not with a crash, but with a collective realization that spread through the disciples like fire through dry tinder. This was beyond them. This was beyond any human power to overcome. They needed help, help that no human could provide, help that perhaps only one person in all the world could offer. Their eyes turned toward the stern, toward the sleeping figure, toward the only hope they had left. Someone would have to wake him. Peter released the steering oar. It was an act of surrender that went against every instinct he possessed, an abandonment of the post he had held through countless storms and crossings and difficult nights on the water. The oar swung free, and the boat immediately began to turn broadside to the waves, the most dangerous position possible, the orientation that could roll them in an instant. But Peter no longer cared. The battle was lost. Human effort had failed. If they were going to survive this night, it would not be because of anything he could do with wood and rope and muscle. He stumbled toward the stern, half crawling across the flooded deck, waves crashing over him as he went. The other disciples watched him go with expressions that mixed hope and desperation in equal measure. They knew what he was doing. They knew why. And though none of them would have admitted it aloud, they were grateful that someone else was taking the initiative, that they would not have to be the one to disturb the master's inexplicable rest. The distance from the steering position to the stern was perhaps 15 feet, a few steps under normal circumstances, an eternity in the chaos of the storm. Peter lost his footing twice, thrown against the gunwale by waves that seemed timed specifically to impede his progress. His hands found ropes, found timber, found anything solid enough to pull himself forward. The water in the boat was knee-deep now in the lowest sections, and more was pouring in with every wave that broke over them. Time was running out. If Jesus did not wake soon, there would be nothing left to wake for. He reached the stern and found himself staring down at a sight that defied everything his senses were telling him about their situation. Jesus lay exactly as he had since the journey began, on his side, his head pillowed on the leather cushion, his face peaceful in repose. The waves that had soaked every other person on the boat seemed somehow to have spared him, or perhaps he was simply so deeply asleep that even wet clothing could not disturb his rest. His chest rose and fell, with the steady rhythm of untroubled sleep, a rhythm so at odds with the frantic chaos surrounding him that Peter felt a flash of something that might have been anger pierce through his fear. How could anyone sleep through this? How could anyone remain unconscious while the people around him fought for their lives, while the boat filled with water, while the wind screamed and the waves crashed and death closed in from every direction? Peter had followed this man for months now, had witnessed miracles that still made his mind reel when he tried to comprehend them, had begun to believe that Jesus might be something more than merely human. But this peaceful oblivion in the face of mortal danger, this he could not understand. He reached down and grabbed Jesus by the shoulder, shaking him with a force that was probably harder than necessary, the accumulated terror and exhaustion of the night expressing itself through his grip. "Teacher!" The word came out as something between a shout and a sob, torn from Peter's throat by emotions he could no longer control. Behind him, he could hear the others crying out as well, their voices joining his in a chorus of desperation that rose above the howling of the wind. They had reached the end of themselves. Every resource they possessed had been depleted. Every strategy they knew had failed. All that remained was this frantic appeal to the one person who might be able to do something, anything, to save them from the death that was closing in. "Teacher, don't you care that we are perishing?" The question contained multitudes. On the surface, it was simply a cry for help, an urgent summons to action in the face of imminent disaster. But beneath the surface, it carried accusations and doubts that the disciples themselves might not have fully recognized. "Don't you care?" The words implied that perhaps he didn't, that his sleep was evidence of indifference, that his peace was purchased at the cost of their suffering, that the one they had trusted with their lives had abandoned them in their moment of greatest need. It was not a fair accusation. Some part of Peter knew that, even as the words left his lips. Jesus had never shown himself to be indifferent to human suffering. Every healing, every exorcism, every teaching had demonstrated a compassion so deep it sometimes seemed to cost him physically. But fear does not traffic in fairness. Terror does not pause to consider context. In that moment, with the waves crashing and the boat sinking and death reaching out its cold hands, Peter could only see what was immediately before him, a master who slept while his disciples drowned. The other disciples had gathered now, pressing close to the stern, their faces pale and streaming with water that might have been waves or might have been tears. James and John were there, the sons of thunder reduced to trembling men clutching the sides of a failing boat. Andrew stood beside his brother, his expression a mirror of Peter's own desperation. Matthew, Philip, Nathaniel, Thomas, the others, all of them had abandoned their posts, their bailing, their futile efforts to control the uncontrollable. They had all reached the same conclusion Peter had reached. If salvation was coming, It would not come from them. Jesus opened his eyes. There was no transition, no gradual awakening, no moment of disorientation as consciousness returned from the depths of sleep. One instant his eyes were closed, his face peaceful, his body at rest. The next instant his eyes were open, alert, fully present, as if he had not been sleeping at all but simply waiting for the moment when his intervention would be necessary. He sat up slowly, and the movement itself seemed to create a small pocket of stillness in the midst of the chaos. The wind still howled, the waves still crashed, the boat still pitched and rolled in the grip of the storm. But around Jesus, there was something else, a quality of calm that radiated outward from his person like heat from a fire. The disciples felt it without being able to name it, a stabilizing presence that began to penetrate their panic even before he had spoken a word. His eyes moved across their faces, taking in their terror, their exhaustion, their desperate hope that he could somehow save them from what seemed like certain death. There was no rebuke in his gaze, not yet, only a profound awareness that seemed to see not just their present fear but its deeper roots, not just the storm around them, but the storms within them. He looked at them the way a father looks at frightened children, the way a shepherd looks at scattered sheep, the way God himself might look at a creation that has forgotten who made it and who sustains it. Then he stood. The boat lurched beneath him as a wave struck the hull, but he did not stumble. His footing was sure, his balance perfect, as if the pitching deck was solid ground beneath his feet. He rose to his full height in the stern of the boat, and for a moment he simply stood there, facing into the wind, his robes whipping around him, his hair streaming back from his face. The disciples watched in breathless silence, their fear momentarily suspended by the sheer unexpectedness of what they were witnessing. The contrast could not have been more stark. Around him, chaos reigned supreme. Wind and wave and darkness combining in an assault that had reduced experienced fishermen to terrified suppliants. Yet he stood in the midst of it all, as if the storm were merely an inconvenience, as if the waves that threatened to swallow them were of no more concern than ripples in a wash basin. His posture was not that of a man preparing to fight for his life. It was the posture of a man surveying his domain, assessing a situation that was entirely under his control. Peter found himself holding his breath, his hand still extended from where he had shaken Jesus awake, his body frozen in the anticipation of whatever was about to happen. He had seen Jesus do miraculous things, had watched him heal the sick, cast out demons, transform water into wine, multiply bread to feed thousands. But those miracles had all occurred in controlled settings, in places where the natural order was stable enough to serve as a backdrop for the supernatural. This was different. This was nature itself in rebellion, the created world unleashing its destructive power against the ones who sailed upon it. What could anyone do against forces like these? The wind howled louder, as if sensing that something was about to change, as if the storm itself were aware of the presence that now stood against it. A wave larger than any that had come before rose up from the darkness, a wall of black water that seemed to reach toward the sky before curling over and crashing down toward the boat. The disciples cried out, bracing for an impact that would surely be their end. But Jesus did not brace. He did not flinch. He did not even seem to notice the wave that was about to engulf them. He simply raised his hand. The gesture was not dramatic, no sweeping motion, no theatrical flourish. He raised his hand the way someone might raise it to greet a friend, or to signal for attention in a crowded room. It was a simple movement, almost casual, utterly at odds with the magnitude of what was happening around him. And then he spoke. His voice should have been lost in the roar of the storm. The wind was screaming, the waves were crashing, the thunder was rolling across the sky, with a volume that seemed capable of drowning out any human utterance. But his voice cut through all of it, not by being louder, but by being something else entirely. It carried an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with identity. It was the voice of one who had the right to command and the power to be obeyed. 2 words, just 2 words, spoken into the teeth of the storm, spoken to the wind and the waves, as if they were servants who had forgotten their place. The disciples leaned forward, straining to hear, desperate to catch whatever instruction or prayer or incantation their master was offering. And what they heard would change everything they thought they knew about the man they followed. "Peace, be still." The words left his lips and entered the storm like a command entering the ears of a servant. They were not shouted, not strained against the wind, not forced through the chaos with desperate effort. They were simply spoken, calmly, authoritatively, with the quiet certainty of one who expected to be obeyed. In the original Aramaic that Jesus spoke, the words carried even more force. Siopa, pefimoso, be silent, be muzzled. The second word was the same term used to silence a demon, to bind a raging spirit, to bring an unruly force under absolute control. He was not asking the storm to stop, he was commanding it. What happened next defied every law of nature that the disciples had ever observed, every pattern of weather they had studied across lifetimes on the water, every expectation of how storms behaved and how they ended. The wind did not gradually diminish. The waves did not slowly subside. The chaos did not fade by degrees into eventual calm. Instead, everything stopped, instantly, completely, as if someone had thrown a switch that governed the very mechanics of the physical world. The wind collapsed into silence. One heartbeat, it was screaming through the rigging, tearing at their clothes, driving the waves into frenzy. The next heartbeat, it was gone. Not reduced, not weakened, but utterly absent. The sudden stillness was so complete that it created its own kind of shock, a vacuum of sound that pressed against the eardrums almost as forcefully as the noise had done. The disciples could hear their own breathing now, ragged and harsh from exertion and terror. They could hear the water dripping from the sail, from the rigging, from their own soaked garments. They could hear the gentle lap of water against the hull, gentle, as if the violence of moments before had never occurred. The waves smoothed into glass. The transformation was instantaneous and impossible. The sea that had been a churning nightmare of white caps and swells simply flattened, the energy draining out of it as if it had been poured through an invisible sieve. The boat, which had been pitching and rolling so violently that standing was impossible, suddenly steadied beneath them. The deck that had been awash with knee-deep water now felt stable, secure, as solid as dry land. The motion that had threatened to throw them overboard with every passing second simply ceased. The clouds parted overhead. It was not a gradual clearing, not the slow dissipation that normally followed a storm's passage. The thick blanket that had obscured every star simply pulled back, retreating to the horizons as if pushed aside by an invisible hand. The moon emerged. They had not even realized there was a moon, so complete had been the darkness, and its silver light spilled across the water, transforming the surface of the lake into a mirror that reflected the suddenly visible heavens. Stars reappeared by the thousands, the familiar constellations taking their places as if they had never been hidden, the Milky Way resuming its luminous arc across the dome of the sky. The silence that followed was unlike any silence the disciples had ever experienced. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. A stillness so profound that it seemed to have weight and texture, a peace so tangible that it pressed against them like a physical force. The air itself felt different, clean, fresh, charged with something that none of them could name, but all of them could feel. It was as if the storm had not merely ended, but had been erased, as if creation itself had been reset to a state of primordial calm. The disciples stood frozen in their positions, scattered across the boat, in the attitudes of men who had been fighting for their lives and suddenly found that the fight was over. Peter remained near the stern, his hand still extended toward Jesus, his mouth open but no words emerging. James and John stood amidships, their hands still gripping ropes that no longer strained against any force. Andrew, Matthew, Philip, the others, all of them had become statues, their bodies locked in place by an awe that transcended anything fear had produced. They were soaked. They were exhausted. They were trembling with the aftershocks of terror that their bodies had not yet realized was no longer necessary. But more than any of that, they were stunned. Completely, utterly, fundamentally stunned by what they had just witnessed. They had seen Jesus do miraculous things before. They had watched him heal the sick with a touch, cast out demons with a word, demonstrate power over the spiritual realm that marked him as someone extraordinary. But this was different. This was not healing a broken body or liberating a tormented soul. This was commanding the physical universe itself, speaking to the wind and the waves as if they were servants awaiting orders, and being obeyed with an immediacy that left no room for doubt about who was truly in control. The boat drifted gently on the now calm water, its motion so slight that it felt almost like floating on air. The water that had filled the hull began to drain through the scuppers, the vessel slowly rising to its proper waterline as the weight of the invading lake returned to where it belonged. The sail hung limp from the mast, unstirred by any breeze, waiting for wind that would come when it was wanted and not before. Everything was still, everything was silent, everything was waiting. Jesus lowered his hand and turned to face his disciples. His expression was not one of triumph or satisfaction at the display of power he had just demonstrated. There was no hint of pride in what he had accomplished, no suggestion that he expected praise or amazement. Instead, his face held something closer to gentle disappointment. Not anger, not frustration, but the kind of sorrow that comes from seeing people you love struggle with something they should have already understood. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost tender, but his words carried a weight that would echo in their memories for the rest of their lives. "Why are you so afraid?" The question hung in the moonlit air, simple on its surface but bottomless in its implications. Why were they afraid? Because a storm had tried to kill them, because the boat had been sinking, because every natural indication had pointed toward imminent death. These seemed like obvious answers, reasonable answers, answers that any sensible person would give. Of course they were afraid. Anyone would have been afraid. But Jesus was not asking about anyone. He was asking about them, the ones who had walked with him, who had seen what he could do, who had heard his teaching about faith and the kingdom of God. He was asking why they, of all people, had responded to the storm as if they were alone on the water, as if there were no power available to them beyond their own failing strength, as if the presence of the Son of God in their boat counted for nothing when the winds began to blow. "Do you still have no faith?" The second question cut deeper than the first. Still, after everything they had witnessed, after the healings and the exorcisms and the teachings that had opened their minds to realities they had never imagined, after the water turned to wine and the bread multiplied to feed thousands, and the demons fled at his command. After all of that, did they still have no faith? Had they learned nothing? Did they still believe that the forces of nature were beyond the reach of the one they called Master? Peter wanted to defend himself. He wanted to explain that the storm had been unlike anything they had ever experienced, that their fear had been reasonable, that even experienced fishermen had limits to what they could endure. But the words died in his throat before they could form. He knew, they all knew, that the defense would not hold. They had seen too much. They had been given too many reasons to trust. And when the test had come, when the opportunity had arrived to demonstrate the faith they claimed to possess, they had failed. They had cried out in terror as if Jesus were merely another passenger on a doomed vessel, as if his presence made no difference, as if they were truly alone. The silence stretched on, none of the disciples willing to break it, none of them knowing what to say in response to the gentle rebuke they had received. The moonlight cast long shadows across the deck, illuminating faces that bore the complex expressions of men experiencing multiple powerful emotions simultaneously. Fear was still there, residual fear, the echo of what they had felt during the storm. But something else was rising alongside it, something that would soon eclipse the fear entirely. Awe, pure, overwhelming, transforming awe. They had known Jesus was special. They had believed him to be a prophet, perhaps the greatest prophet Israel had ever produced. Some of them had begun to suspect he might be the Messiah, the promised one who would deliver God's people from their oppressors. But prophets did not command the weather. Messiahs, in the popular imagination, were political and military leaders, not masters of wind and wave. What they had just witnessed pointed towards something else entirely, a category of being that their religious training had not prepared them to recognize. The scripture spoke of one who controlled the sea. The psalm sang of Yahweh, who stilled the roaring of the waves, who set boundaries for the deep that it could not cross, who spoke and created and commanded all of nature with sovereign authority. Job remembered God's words to the ancient ocean. "This far you may come and know. Father, here is where your proud waves halt. These were divine prerogatives, the exclusive powers of the Creator himself. And now they had seen those powers exercised by a man standing in the back of a fishing boat. The implications were staggering, too large to process in a single moment, too profound to absorb while their clothes still dripped with the water of the storm they had just survived. But the implications were there nonetheless, pressing against the boundaries of their understanding, demanding to be acknowledged even if they could not yet be fully embraced. Jesus did not press the point. He did not explain what his power over the storm was meant to reveal about his identity. He simply looked at them with those eyes that seemed to see everything, their fear, their faith, their confusion, their dawning awareness. And then he returned to the stern of the boat. He sat down on the same cushion where he had slept through the tempest, his posture relaxed, his manner calm, as if nothing particularly unusual had occurred. The disciples watched him, still unable to move, still processing the reality of what they had experienced. The night was beautiful now, gentle breeze returning to fill the sail, moonlight sparkling on the glassy water, stars blazing overhead with a brilliance that seemed almost intentional, as if the heavens themselves were celebrating the restoration of order. The eastern shore was visible in the distance, a dark line against the slightly lighter sky, the destination that had seemed unreachable now waiting to receive them. But none of them moved to take up the oars or adjust the sail. None of them resumed the practical tasks of sailing that would carry them to the far side of the lake. They simply stood in their places, breathing the clean air, feeling the gentle motion of the boat beneath them, trying to comprehend what had just happened and what it meant for everything they thought they knew. The storm was over. The danger had passed. They were alive when they should have been dead, safe when they should have been drowning, at peace when they should have been in turmoil. And the man who had made it all possible was resting quietly at the stern, as if commanding the forces of nature were simply part of an ordinary evening's work. The disciples looked at one another, and in their eyes the same question formed, a question none of them had the courage to answer, but none of them could avoid asking. Who was this man they were following, and what had they gotten themselves into by saying yes when he called? The question broke the silence like a stone breaking the surface of still water. Who is this? Peter's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the preternatural quiet that had settled over the lake it carried to every ear on the boat. Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? He was not asking Jesus. He was asking himself, asking his fellow disciples, asking the universe that had just rearranged itself at the command of the man resting at the stern. The question was not rhetorical. It demanded an answer, an explanation, some framework that could contain what they had just witnessed. But no answer came, because none of them possessed the categories necessary to provide one. James moved first, stepping carefully across the still wet deck to stand beside his brother John. Their eyes met, and in that exchange passed a lifetime of shared experience. Storms weathered together, catches hauled in together, dangers faced and survived together on this very lake. They had seen things that would make landlubbers tremble. They had earned the nickname Sons of Thunder through displays of boldness that bordered on recklessness. But this was beyond anything their experience could illuminate. The prophets called down fire from heaven, John said slowly, working through the evidence as if constructing an argument in his own mind. Elijah stopped the rain and started it again. Moses parted the sea. He paused, his brow furrowed. But they prayed. They asked God to act. They were instruments. He didn't pray, James finished the thought, his voice hushed with the weight of what he was saying. He didn't ask anyone for anything. He just spoke, and it happened. The distinction was crucial, and everyone present understood its implications even if they could not fully articulate them. The great miracle workers of Israel's history had always operated as intermediaries, channeling divine power through petition and faith. They asked, and God answered. They requested, and God responded. The power was never their own. It flowed through them from a source beyond themselves, and everyone who witnessed their miracles understood that the glory belonged to Yahweh alone. But Jesus had not asked. He had not prayed. He had not lifted his eyes to heaven or called upon the name of the Lord. He had simply spoken to the wind and the waves as if they were his to command, as if he possessed inherent authority over the forces of nature, as if the power resided not in some external source but in himself. The wind and waves had obeyed not because God had heard a prayer and chosen to intervene, but because the one speaking had the right to be obeyed. Andrew had retrieved the oars and was mechanically preparing to row, his hands performing the familiar motions while his mind grappled with unfamiliar thoughts. "At the Jordan," he said, his voice distant with memory. "When John baptized him, the heavens opened, a voice spoke, it said..." He trailed off, unwilling or unable to complete the sentence. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased," Matthew finished for him. The former tax collector had joined the group later than the fisherman, but he had heard the stories, had pieced together the narrative of Jesus' emergence from obscurity into public ministry. The voice called him son, not servant, not prophet, son. The word hung in the air, pregnant with meaning that pressed against the boundaries of what they had been raised to believe. The God of Israel was one. This was the fundamental confession of Jewish faith, the Shema that every faithful Jew recited daily. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." The idea of God having a son in any literal sense was foreign to their theology, bordering on the blasphemous. And yet the voice from heaven had used that word, and now the man to whom that word applied was resting peacefully in their boat, having just demonstrated authority over creation that belonged to the Creator alone. Philip, always the practical one, tried to find solid ground amid the theological vertigo. "He healed my friend's daughter," he said, grasping for data points that might help construct a coherent picture. "He touched a leper and the man was clean. He told the paralytic his sins were forgiven, and the man walked." He shook his head slowly. "We said he must be a prophet. We thought maybe he was the Messiah, the one who would restore the kingdom to Israel. But prophets don't command the weather. And the Messiah is supposed to be a king, a warrior. Not this. Not this." The inadequacy of every category they possessed was becoming painfully clear. Jesus fit none of the boxes they had prepared for him. He was a teacher, yes, but his teaching carried authority that no rabbi had ever claimed. He was a healer, certainly, but his healings were accompanied by pronouncements of forgiveness that only God could rightly make. He was perhaps a prophet, but prophets delivered messages from God. They did not speak as God, with God's own authority flowing directly from their lips. And if he was the Messiah, he was a Messiah, unlike anything their traditions had led them to expect. Thomas, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. His voice carried the careful precision of a man who distrusted easy answers and demanded evidence before belief. "In the beginning," he said slowly, "God spoke, and there was light. God spoke, and there was sky and sea and land. God spoke, and the world came into being." He looked toward the stern where Jesus sat in perfect calm. Tonight he spoke, and the storm ceased. The wind obeyed his voice, the waves submitted to his word. Thomas paused, and when he continued, his voice trembled slightly. "Who speaks like that? Who has that kind of authority over creation?" No one answered, because the answer was too enormous to speak aloud. The scriptures were clear about who commanded creation with a word. The Psalms sang it. He spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. Job proclaimed it. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. The prophets declared it. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord? These were not descriptions of prophets or kings or even angels. These were descriptions of Yahweh himself, the Almighty, the I am who had revealed himself to Moses in the burning bush. The disciples were not theologians, they were fishermen and tax collectors, ordinary men from ordinary backgrounds who had been swept up into an extraordinary story. They did not possess the vocabulary to articulate what was forming in their minds, the dawning recognition that refused to fully crystallize but could no longer be entirely suppressed. They only knew that the man in their boat was something more than they had understood, something more than they could easily categorize, something that pointed toward conclusions that would have seemed blasphemous if the evidence were not so overwhelming. The boat drifted on the glassy water, its sail hanging slack, its passengers too absorbed in wonder to attend to the practical matters of navigation. The moonlight continued to pour down from the cleared sky, silver and luminous, transforming the Sea of Galilee into a mirror that reflected the stars. The other boats that had followed them from shore were visible again now, scattered across the water at various distances, their occupants surely as shaken as the disciples themselves. What stories would they tell when they reached land? What questions would they carry with them for the rest of their lives? Jesus remained at the stern, his eyes closed now, his breathing steady, as if he had simply returned to the rest that the disciples' panic had interrupted. There was no indication that he was listening to their whispered conversation, no sign that he intended to explain what he had done or what it meant. He had asked his questions. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? And he had let the questions stand, trusting them to work their way into hearts that were not yet ready for direct answers. Perhaps that was part of his method. Throughout his ministry, Jesus had consistently refused to make explicit claims that his listeners were not prepared to receive. He taught in parables that concealed as much as they revealed. He accepted titles like teacher and master while deflecting more loaded designations. He performed miracles that pointed toward his identity without forcing conclusions upon those who witnessed them. He was, in a sense, creating space for faith to develop organically, for understanding to dawn gradually, for the truth about who he was to emerge not through proclamation, but through accumulating evidence that could not be explained any other way. This storm, this miracle, was another piece of that evidence. The disciples would not fully understand its implications tonight, or tomorrow, or perhaps for months or years to come, but they would remember. They would carry the memory of this night with them through everything that followed. The continued ministry in Galilee, the journey to Jerusalem, the horror of the crucifixion, the glory of the resurrection. And when they finally understood, when the pieces finally fell into place and they grasped who Jesus truly was, they would look back on this night and realize that the answer had been there all along, written in the suddenly calm water and the instantly silent wind. Peter finally moved to take up the oars, his body responding to the ingrained habits of a lifetime even while his mind continued to reel. The others followed his lead, resuming their positions, preparing to complete the crossing they had begun what felt like a lifetime ago. The eastern shore was closer now than the western shore they had left behind, and the practical necessities of reaching land began to reassert themselves over the theological earthquake that had just shaken their understanding. But even as they rowed, the conversation continued in fragments and whispers. Nathanael recalled his first meeting with Jesus, when the Master had demonstrated knowledge that should have been impossible. Matthew remembered the day Jesus had looked at him in his tax booth and simply said, "Follow me," and how that simple command had carried an authority that brooked no refusal. Andrew thought about his brother's confession at Caesarea Philippi, still months in the future but already germinating in the soil of nights like this one. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." The oars dipped and pulled, carrying them steadily toward the shore. The water offered no resistance now, as docile as a tamed animal, as peaceful as if it had never known fury. The wind remained calm, a gentle breeze barely sufficient to stir their still damp clothing. The night had become beautiful in a way that seemed almost intentional, as if creation itself were displaying its best behaviour in the presence of the one who had just demonstrated mastery over its worst. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, the region of the Gerasenes waited. Gentile territory, a place of tombs and demons and people who had never heard the good news about the kingdom of God. Jesus had said they were going to the other side, and now they understood that he had meant it. The storm had not altered his plans. The fury of wind and wave had not diverted his course. Whatever waited for them on that far shore, they would reach it, because the one who commanded the weather had determined that they would. The disciples rode on through the moonlit night, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing, their hearts suspended between the fear that had nearly destroyed them and the awe that was slowly taking its place. They did not speak much anymore. The questions they carried were too large for casual conversation, too profound for the easy answers that talk sometimes provides. They simply rowed and wondered and watched the sleeping figure at the stern with new eyes. The question would stay with them. It would follow them through the days and months and years ahead, demanding an answer they were not yet ready to give. Who is this? Who is this man who teaches with authority, who heals with a touch, who forgives sins and casts out demons and commands the forces of nature as if they were servants awaiting his orders? The sea was quiet now, the storm a fading memory, the danger past. But the question the storm had raised would never entirely fade, would never fully pass. It would grow louder with every miracle they witnessed, more insistent with every teaching they heard, more unavoidable with every evidence that accumulated. Who is this? The answer, when it finally came, would change not just their lives, but the entire course of human history. But for now, they could only row toward the shore, carrying their question like precious cargo, waiting for the dawn that would eventually break over their understanding as it was already beginning to break over the eastern hills. The boat touched the eastern shore as the first pale light of dawn began to soften the darkness over the hills of the Decapolis. The keel scraped against sand and pebbles, a gentle sound after the violence of the night, and the disciples stepped out into shallow water that lapped peacefully against their ankles. Their legs were unsteady, partly from exhaustion, partly from the hours of pitching and rolling that their bodies had not yet forgotten, partly from a disorientation that went deeper than physical fatigue. They had left one shore as men who thought they understood their teacher. They arrived at another as men who realized they had barely begun to comprehend him. The landscape that greeted them was different from the familiar hills of Galilee. Here the terrain was wilder, the vegetation sparser, the signs of human habitation fewer and farther between. Tombs carved into the hillside spoke of different burial customs than those practiced in Jewish territory. The occasional pig could be seen in the distance, rooting through the scrub, an animal that no observant Jew would raise or touch, but that the Gentile population of this region kept in abundance. They had crossed more than a body of water during the night. They had crossed from one world into another, from the familiar into the foreign, from territory where the God of Israel was worshipped into lands where other gods held sway. But they had not made that crossing alone. Jesus stepped out of the boat behind them, his feet finding the same sand, his eyes surveying the same unfamiliar landscape. Whatever awaited them in this place, and something was waiting, they could sense it in the strange stillness of the morning air. They would face it with the one who had just demonstrated that wind and waves were subject to his command. The fears that had nearly overwhelmed them on the water began to recede in the light of that demonstration. If he could calm a storm with a word, what could they possibly encounter that would be beyond his power to address? The sun crept higher, painting the water behind them in shades of gold and rose, transforming the sea that had tried to kill them into a canvas of breathtaking beauty. The disciples turned to look at it. This lake they had known all their lives, this body of water that had given them their livelihoods and shaped their identities, this place where they had just experienced the most terrifying and the most wonderful night of their existence. It lay calm now, innocent, as if it had never known fury, as if the waves that had crashed over their boat were merely a dream from which they had finally awakened. Peter stood at the water's edge, letting the gentle wavelets wash over his feet, his mind still churning with everything he had experienced. The fear was fading, but something else was taking its place, a complex mixture of wonder, humility, and the first stirrings of a faith that would eventually become unshakable. He had failed last night. He had panicked when he should have trusted. He had cried out in accusation when he should have rested in confidence. The Master's gentle rebuke, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" echoed in his memory with a sting that was also somehow a gift. Jesus had not rejected him for his failure. He had simply pointed toward a better way, a deeper trust, a faith that could remain calm even when the waves were crashing. The other disciples gathered nearby, some sitting on the rocks to rest their weary bodies, others standing in small groups and speaking in low voices about the night they had just survived. They were processing the experience in their own ways, each one filtering it through the lens of his own history, his own doubts, his own emerging understanding of who Jesus might be. The theological conversation that had begun on the boat would continue for years. Indeed, it would continue for centuries, as generation after generation grappled with the same question that had formed on their lips in the moonlit aftermath of the miracle. Who is this? The question was not merely historical, not simply a puzzle about a figure from the past. It was immediate and urgent, pressing itself upon anyone who encountered the story with an open heart. Who is this man who speaks and the wind obeys? Who is this teacher whose authority extends not just over demons and diseases, but over the very fabric of the physical world? Who is this one who sleeps peacefully in the midst of chaos, not because he is unaware of the danger, but because he knows something about reality that the danger cannot touch? The disciples would eventually find their answer. In the months and years that followed this night, they would see more miracles, hear more teaching, witness more evidence of an identity that could not be contained by any merely human category. They would watch Jesus walk on the water that had terrified them, see him feed thousands with a handful of bread, hear him claim titles and prerogatives that belong to God alone. They would follow him to Jerusalem, endure the horror of his crucifixion, encounter the glory of his resurrection, and when the pieces finally fell into place, when Thomas knelt before the risen Christ and declared, "My Lord and my God," they would remember this night on the Sea of Galilee as one of the first moments when the truth had begun to dawn. But the story does not belong only to them. It reaches across the centuries, spanning the vast distance between that first-century fishing boat and the lives of all who have heard it since, carrying with it an invitation that transcends time and culture and circumstance. We all face storms. They come in different forms than the one that descended on the Sea of Galilee that night, but they come nonetheless. The diagnosis that arrives without warning, shattering the calm of ordinary life with news that changes everything. The relationship that fractures beyond repair, leaving us adrift in waters we never expected to navigate. The loss that opens beneath our feet like a chasm, swallowing the security we thought we possessed. The anxiety that rises like wind in the night, howling through our thoughts, driving waves of fear that threaten to swamp the fragile vessel of our peace. In those moments, we cry out much as the disciples cried out. Our words may be different, but the essence is the same. Don't you care that we are perishing? We look for God in the midst of our chaos and find what appears to be absence, a sleeping Saviour, an unresponsive heaven, a silence that feels like abandonment. We wonder if we've been forgotten, if our suffering matters, if anyone with the power to help is paying attention to our plight. The story of the calming of the storm speaks directly to those moments. It does not promise that the storms will never come. The disciples faced this tempest precisely because they had obeyed Jesus' command to cross the lake. Following him does not exempt us from difficulty. Sometimes it leads us directly into it. But the story does promise something else, something that matters far more than the mere avoidance of hardship. It promises presence. It promises power. It promises that the one who commands the wind and the waves is in the boat with us, and that his apparent sleep is not evidence of his indifference, but of his absolute confidence in his own ability to handle whatever comes. Why are you so afraid? The question that Jesus asked his disciples is the same question he asks us. It is not a rebuke that shames, but a redirection that heals. Fear is natural. Fear is human. The disciples were not wrong to recognize the danger they were in, but fear that forgets the presence of Christ is fear that has lost its proper proportion. When we remember who is in the boat with us, the storms do not necessarily cease, but our experience of them is transformed. We can face the wind and the waves with a different kind of courage, not the courage of those who believe they can handle anything, but the courage of those who know they are accompanied by one who can. Do you still have no faith? This question cuts deeper, pressing past the immediate crisis to the underlying issue. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the presence of trust that coexists with fear and ultimately overcomes it. The disciples had seen enough by that point to trust Jesus even in the storm. We, who have the benefit of the complete story, the cross, the resurrection, the centuries of testimony from those who have found him faithful, have even more reason to trust. Our faith may falter, as theirs did. We may cry out in panic, as they did. But the invitation remains, to believe that the one who spoke the universe into existence is not powerless in the face of our particular tempest, however overwhelming it may seem. Peace, be still. These words were spoken to the wind and the waves, but they echo into every human heart that has ever been tossed by the storms of life. The same voice that commanded the Sea of Galilee into glassy calm can speak peace into the churning waters of anxiety, of grief, of despair. He does not always calm the external circumstances. The storm of illness, of loss, of difficulty may continue to rage around us. But he offers something that perhaps matters more, an internal peace that persists even when the external chaos continues, a stillness at the centre of our being that the waves cannot reach, a rest that is not dependent on the resolution of our problems, but on the presence of our Saviour. The boat that carried the disciples across the Sea of Galilee eventually rotted away, its timbers returning to the earth from which they came. The cushion on which Jesus laid his head has long since turned to dust. The lake itself remains, still prone to sudden storms, still beautiful in its dangerous moods, still reflecting the same stars that witnessed the miracle 2,000 years ago. But the story endures, told and retold, remembered and cherished, carried from generation to generation, as a testimony to the power and the peace that are available to all who follow the one who commands the wind and the waves. The disciples stood on that eastern shore as the sun continued to rise, their wet clothing beginning to dry in the warming air, their exhausted bodies drawing strength from the solid ground beneath their feet. They did not know what the day would bring. In fact, within hours they would witness another astounding display of Jesus' authority as he freed a man possessed by a legion of demons and restored him to his right mind. The adventures were only beginning. The revelations were only starting to unfold. The faith that had faltered in the night would be tested and strengthened countless times before it reached its full maturity. But they knew something they had not known before. They knew that the one they followed was more than a teacher, more than a healer, more than a prophet or even a king. They knew that in his presence even the most terrifying storms could be stilled with a word. They knew that his peace was not the fragile peace of favourable circumstances, but the unshakable peace of sovereign authority. And they knew that whatever they faced in the days ahead, whatever winds arose, whatever waves crashed, whatever darkness descended, they would face it with him. The sea stretched out behind them, calm and glittering in the morning light, a silent witness to what had happened in the night. The hills of the Decapolis rose before them, mysterious and waiting, holding secrets that would soon be revealed. And between the sea and the hills, on the narrow strip of sand where water met land, stood a small group of ordinary men who'd just begun to glimpse an extraordinary truth. The one who calmed the storm was with them still. He would be with them always, through every storm that awaited, through every fear that arose, through death itself and out the other side into resurrection life. And 2,000 years later, he is with us still. The storms will come, they always do, but so does he, the one who speaks peace into chaos, who commands the wind and the waves, who asks us why we're afraid and invites us into a faith that can weather any tempest. Peace, be still. The words echo across the centuries, as powerful now as they were on that night when darkness covered the Sea of Galilee, and the disciples learned that they were following someone who held all of creation in his hands. May we hear them in our own storms, may we trust the one who speaks them, and may we find, as the disciples found, that his presence is enough for the storms without, and enough for the storms within. The boat has reached the shore, the crossing is complete, but the journey continues, and the one who began it with us will see it through to the end. Peace, be still, and know that he is God.